So Joaquin Buckley just had an impressive performance this past weekend against his opponent Jordan Wright on the prelims of UFC 255. He scored himself a second round TKO. It was very impressive. He added to his highlight reel. I know he's never really going to beat that highlight against Impa Kasanganay because I don't think anyone ever for the rest of time is going to beat that highlight reel against Impa Kasanganay. But Joaquin Buckley collected his performance of the night bonus. He kept his momentum going, and I know a lot of people expected him to do that to Jordan Wright, but he had to live up to those expectations, and that's exactly what he did. But I don't even want to talk about his performance. I want to talk to you guys about his post-fight interview with Joe Rogan, where he called out a man who he wouldn't name, and it wasn't Voldemort, by the way. It was someone else that shouldn't be named, and his name was the James Krause. Joaquin Buckley called him out, said if he wants to keep talking on social media, let's get to work, let's make the fight happen in January on the 23rd, which I loved, by the way, because it was a very strategic call out. Okay, Joaquin Buckley could have just called out James Krause and left it there, but no, he made Joe Rogan get the information out of him, which made Joe Rogan say, you're talking about James Krause. I can already hear the soundbite in a promo for their fight as the co-main event of a fight night or the headliner of some prelims. I can hear the soundbite of Joe Rogan saying, you're talking about James Krause, and then the promo switching to James Krause highlights. I can hear it already. It's going to be amazing. Called out James Krause in the post-fight interview. Really good call out. Also, I want to mention, made sure he mentioned the date of 23rd of January in 2021, which is McGregor's card with Poirier. I think he could sneak his way onto the main card. Otherwise, he'd definitely be headlining the prelims of that card. Joaquin Buckley versus James Krause is an amazing bout. James Krause posted a picture saying, say my name, and it was a picture of himself. James Krause has been going at Joaquin Buckley recently after his performance against Impa Kasanganay. He knows Joaquin Buckley from the regional scene of MMA gyms that he is around. Apparently, Joaquin Buckley, according to James Krause, and I'll tell you this, I really believe James Krause in his interview. Like, it was not like out of spite. Like, I don't see the motive for James Krause to jump on Joaquin Buckley unless he's telling the truth. And he seemed very, very genuine in his interview. He said, I don't like Joaquin Buckley. I told him to get fucked when he asked to train at my gym with me and my guys because I've heard all stories about him picking on bantamweights. You hear stories of him getting kicked out of gyms because he's too rough and he headhunts versus his training partners and tries to get KOs. Joaquin Buckley says that didn't happen, but it was just something about the interview of James Krause, and I saw the comments of that as well. A lot of people agree with me here. I just spat everywhere, by the way. That was crazy. This video coming to you in 3D. I don't know how I just produced that spit out of my mouth. Out of nowhere. Just all of it came out at once. But anyway, that's how excited I am about this fight. James Krause versus Joaquin Buckley. It seemed genuine the way James Krause said it in his interview. So I think there's some real animosity and beef here. James Krause seems up for the task. I know he got injured in his last fight against Sergio Moraes to his knee. I don't know how much it's going to bother him, and I don't know how long he's going to have to take out of the cage before being able to return. So I think that maybe January 23rd could be wishful thinking. I know James Krause said he'd come back early next year. I thought he was talking around the February-March range, but listen, there's a really hyped up fight for James Krause to reignite his career that was stolen away from him in his Trevin Giles robbery decision because some guy gave Trevin Giles the first round when James Krause had his back for 3.5 minutes. Even still, he's going to reignite his career here if he gets a big win against the up-and-comer Joaquin Buckley. Because listen, Joaquin Buckley, although has an amazing record of highlights and has that finish against Impa Kasanganay and now has a finish against Jordan Wright, he's beatable. And he's been KO'd before. And he's been taken to a decision before and out-grappled by Logan Storley. And I know that's an amazing fighter, but Kevin Holland really did stuff to him. Like, people forget this, but before Joaquin Buckley's KO highlight of the decade against Impa Kasanganay, Kevin Holland might have at the time scored himself a KO of the year candidate with a walk-off finish against Joaquin Buckley. Like, people forget that Joaquin Buckley, although having these big KO wins, can lose, and maybe James Krause is that level of fighter that's going to show some holes in the game of Joaquin Buckley's style because he is quite wild. I feel like there is going to be a level of opponent that is going to figure him out, but he's a very fun fighter to watch, and I'll watch him while he's getting these KO finishes, but still, this is a very important fight. And Joaquin Buckley came out in his post-fight press conference as well and said that James Krause just trying to hold a brother down. You know how they do. So he's pulling the race card, but like, it's not really the race card, but he's trying to implicate that James Krause is just, because he's a brother, James Krause is trying to pull him down. I don't get why James Krause would do that. And also, I do want to mention this. If he's using that card on James Krause in any way, I'm not saying he 100% is, but the way he said it made it sound like he is trying to pull that card on James Krause. If you're trying to pull that card, you can't be turned down by Tyron Woodley, the king of pulling those cards. I mean, he's the card czar. He's the race card czar of this. Like, he's the dealer of the cards. He's the dealer of the race cards. Like, Tyron Woodley's turning you down from his gym, supposedly, because you train a little bit too hard and you didn't fit in with his gym. And I don't know, man. It just doesn't seem too good for Joaquin Buckley right now. But if he gets a win against James Krause, no one will care about what happens in Joaquin Buckley's gym. But maybe he just was a young guy in the gym, went a little bit too hard, had a point to prove, KO'd a couple of guys. You know, these things happen. I'm sure there's a lot of these customers in gyms. I mean, there might be a reason why Mike Perry doesn't really train at a gym full-time anymore. I could see Mike Perry being one of those guys who headhunts for guys in the gym. But still, I'm going to ignore all of that. I'm not going to take any animosity into my prediction. I think Joaquin Buckley finishes James Krause if they fight at middleweight. I think if they fight in the middleweight division, which, by the way, Joaquin Buckley mentioned is where he wants this fight to take place, James Krause made the brutal mistake of mentioning, yeah, I'll go up to middleweight. He should never have said that in the interview. If James Krause stuck to saying, yeah, come down to welterweight, we'll get it on, I'll beat you up. You fought at welterweight before, Joaquin Buckley. But James Krause made the mistake of saying, yeah, middleweight, yeah. But I'm sure that James Krause knows there's a much, much bigger chance of him beating Joaquin Buckley if he makes Buckley drain down to the welterweight division. That's a much more natural division for James Krause. I know Joaquin Buckley said that, you know, James Krause has fought a middleweight before. That was on a day's notice against Giles, which he arguably won. And Giles is a good fight for Joaquin Buckley that would be quite close. I'm sure the odds wouldn't be ridiculously in favour of Joaquin Buckley in that contest. But still, James Krause is very good, and I think at welterweight, he'd actually give Joaquin Buckley some huge problems and maybe make him look a little bit silly. But in the middleweight division, I just see Joaquin Buckley being a little bit too big for him, a little bit too aggressive, especially if he knows that James Krause is going to be the smaller welterweight moving up. Joaquin Buckley will try and pack on some weight. I know he weighed a little bit under the weight limit this weekend, or this past weekend against Jordan Wright. He weighed in at about 183 point something pounds, 184 pounds, something along those lines. He'll try and bulk up a little bit more if James Krause is going to be a welterweight coming up and really use that size advantage. So I think he would beat James Krause in the middleweight division pretty handily. But at welterweight, you've got yourself a real scrap, which is why I would want it at welterweight, because I want to see Joaquin at welterweight. You know, I think he could make it. I think he'd be a real problem down there. I think he'd have more championship chances in the welterweight division just because of how big he would be. But also he'd cut a lot of weight and he's been KO'd in his career before, so maybe that would backfire on him. But I will say this. I think it's a little bit unfair to make James Krause go to middleweight for this, because James Krause, people forget this because they've only joined him recently to the UFC, but used to be a lightweight his pretty much whole career. Like, he moved up to welterweight for a new look, and it's worked for him. I mean, if you don't count the robbery to Trevin Giles, James Krause is on an 8-fight win streak in the UFC right now, and he's an older veteran. I mean, people don't give James Krause the credit he deserves. He hasn't lost a fight since, what, 2015? Let me check. 2015, I want to say. He lost a fight in February of 2015, a split decision to Valmir Lazaro. Split decision in February, and since then he's beat Darren Cruikshank, Shane Campbell, had exhibition bouts on The Ultimate Fighter against Najem, Nunes won those, lost to Jesse Taylor, but Jesse Taylor was roided out of his fucking mind on that season. He eventually got caught for it. I don't know if you guys remember Jesse Taylor on that season. His head literally would change size between scenes on The Ultimate Fighter. Jesse Taylor was roided to the gills, ended up beating James Krause, but still, Krause comes back, beats Tom Gallicchio, then beats Alex White. Of course, that was an exhibition bout against Jesse Taylor, so it doesn't count towards his record. Continues his streak at welterweight. Tom Gallicchio, Alex White, Wale Alves, Sergio Moraes, really good performances non-stop. Then has a grappling bout with King Mo and submits him in the first round by guillotine, goes to a draw with Gilbert Melendez, arguably beats Trevin Giles, moving up a weight class on short notice, on a day's notice as well, the shortest notice there ever has been, beats Claudio Silva recently as well, comes back. I think he may be not able to fight in January, but I do want to see this fight get made, because I'll tell you this, there's a lot of UFC fights that don't get made, because the UFC don't understand the actual fights that the fans want to see. I don't think the UFC understand that there is real fan attraction to a Craig versus Ankleev rematch, because I don't think they understand the meme side of the hardcore MMA community. You know, there's a lot of fights like Darren Till, Mike Perry. I don't think they would seriously consider that right now, but if Perry loses, I mean, if Till loses again, like, there's certain fights that you wouldn't understand the fans wanting unless you were really in the MMA community and understood the memes and the comment sections and stuff like this. Like, I feel like a lot of people want to see this Joaquin Buckley versus James Krause fight. I hope the UFC are hearing it, and now that Joaquin Buckley has said it in a post-fight speech, I'm sure they're going to be thinking of making that fight. And I think if Joaquin Buckley wins this one, now it's time for a jump up the rankings. I know he's beat a lot of bad guys, and Jordan Wright was not a good fighter. He was 11-0, but he beat a bunch of cans. He showed up quite well against Buckley, but it wasn't the best fighter in the world. He beat Impa Sangane, which is a great win, and that's what burst him onto the scene. And I think if he beats James Krause, that might be the last, because James Krause at middleweight against Buckley is a big deal. So it changes the fight massively. So I feel like that would be the last, don't want to say layup, but that would be the last winnable fight we'd give Buckley that isn't too competitive in the middleweight division. And after that, if he does beat James Krause, I could see him being matched up against guys like Brendan Allen, Sean Strickland, Christoph Jotko, these kind of guys that are going to get him towards the rankings but not put him in the rankings. And if he wins that one, then we jump him up into the rankings and see what he can do in the middleweight division. But right now, I think it should be at middleweight, because Krause said he would do it, but I know that Krause kind of wants it at welterweight because he could probably beat him there. So it's a weird situation right now. But I want Buckley to stay in the middleweight division. I know I'd like to see him at welterweight. I'd like to see a lot of people change up divisions. It's just a fantasy of mine. I'd like to see how they change their style and see how they look and see if they look even better. But I think Buckley should stay in the middleweight division purely because we need stars coming up the middleweight division more than we do in the welterweight. The welterweight division has got guys right now. Okay, we're fine in the welterweight division. Middleweight it has some good guys coming up. We could do with all the guys we get right now. Buckley in the middleweight division is what I want to see. I do want to mention this though. This fight could be the start of the legendary and a new meme of the MMA community. Could be born if James Krause pulls off the upset. The legend of Full Camp Krause. It even alliterates, even though they're different letters. It's fate. Full Camp Krause might be the best fighter in the world, because on a day's notice, he can beat Trevin Giles, who can beat Bevon Lewis, who can be beating Uriah Hall for the entire fight before getting KO'd. James Krause is no slouch, and on short notice, he can step up and beat an undefeated guy pretty much in Sergio Moraes, who has a win over Leon Edwards, and although he's a little bit older right now, I'm sure we can all agree it wasn't even Sergio Moraes, it was Claudio Silva. He also beat Sergio Moraes, though. He's beaten all of these guys on short notice, not a full camp. If he gets a full camp of training for Joaquin Buckley and builds himself a little bit more into the middleweight division and gets a full camp of cardio and doesn't slow down as the fight goes on like he did against Giles, which was the only reason Giles had a chance in that fight, I believe he could be legendary. So that's what you're kind of hazarding your bets on. I think Joaquin Buckley would catch him on the chin. I mean, James Krause is good, but I do think he leaves himself a little bit vulnerable. And if Claudio Silva can touch you even a couple of times in those rounds, Buckley's going to close the distance way faster and hit way harder as well while doing it. I don't think it'd be good for Krause. I think he would get KO'd. I reckon he'd get KO'd in the late second, third, after maybe giving Buckley some tricky situations in the clinch against the cage, maybe landing a couple of jabs and picking apart Buckley in the first round. I think eventually Buckley would catch him because Krause gets he's a little bit too confident in his head movement, and I don't like it because I feel like eventually he's going to pull back a little bit, not far enough, and this time it will be Buckley hitting you on the chin, and it'll be a bit of a different situation because Buckley's a beast. I'm going to go with Buckley by KO at middleweight. I'd go with Krause by decision at welterweight though. That's how much a weight class can change things. Good fight though. Looking forward to it. Just spat again before the end. Really excited. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. It was a good call out as well, you've got to admit. Even though Joaquin Buckley hasn't really showed his personality side too much, I think we saw a bit of it in the embedded that came out. 255 embedded showed him for a little bit more, and a lot more people got invested in Joaquin Buckley. In that post-fight speech, you've got to give it to him. I like the emotion of it, you know what I mean? I don't like someone who gets on the post-fight speech and just reads out stuff in a monotone voice. Yeah, I want this guy next because I think it'd be a good fight for me, and I really don't like him. And I like the real anger that Buckley showed, even not even wanting to say Krause's name. It's amazing. Krause accepts it. Let's make the fight next year. UFC is so good, man. UFC is so good. The UFC this year, I feel like, is the only time over the past 2 years, I would say, where guys that are unranked and like just getting into the scene can make you have that championship fight feel. I don't think we've had that before. Like, even when McGregor was fighting Brimage and McGregor was fighting Holloway, I didn't have that championship fight feel when I was watching it. You know what I mean? But now I feel like seeing these young guys rise up, there's a lot more attention about these streaking contenders, and they give you that feeling of like, this is the big fight of the card, even if they're on the prelims. It's weird, but I love it right now. Thank you for watching. Click that button up there, and goodbye. See you later.